Just what the heck do knitters and crocheters have against each other anyway? I mean, they both like yarn, they both keep companies like Clover and Michaels alive, and if you manage to catch either breed of crafter far enough away from each other, they're generally lovely, compassionate folk. But mention either craft to their opposite contemporary and you'll be met with sly jabs, snarky remarks, and outright distaste. I'm not even immune. I'm pretty sure I made snarky remarks about crochet pre-2019 when I decided teaching myself the craft would be a nice way to jumpstart my brain into learning mode. Would you be surprised to learn it wasn't always this way? Get out your yarn stitches. This week we're talking about the war between knitting and crochet.
Crocheters vs. Knitters, WTF. The Yarn Harlot made at least one jab at crocheters in her first book. Debbie Stoller states that knitters and crocheters are usually two opposing forces in the Intro to Happy Hooker, and says knitters would wonder why she turned coat and did a crochet book. In the editor's letter of the first Interweave Knits crochet issue, they said that their readers would wonder why they made a crochet issue. Why must it be odd when a knitter crochets or a crocheter knit? punk_knitters.livejournal.com, March 18th, 2006 at 11:12 p.m.
Quick backstory. Everyone in my family says my late granny was a capital K knitter, and this has been her legacy to the rest of the family. If you knit, you have to try to live up to granny's example and experience. However, I was lucky enough to have granny in my life well into my late teens, and I distinctly remember her picking up small crochet projects or sewing as the need presented itself. My parents' Christmas tree topper is an intricately crocheted angel that was made by granny, and she apparently pulled my mum headlong into other projects like starched crocheted lace snowflake ornaments to go along with the angel. I really do have to rewrite the family history here. Granny was a straight-up yarn enabler, and that's a legacy I'm more than proud to carry forward. So why do we all recall Granny as a master knitter? Simple. We live in Canada and the weather can be cold here. If you're on the East Coast or along the St. Lawrence Seaway, you're looking at a lot of damp that seeps into your bones. In the prairies, you have west winds that lose their warmth and moisture going over the Rocky Mountains, and northern winds that sweep down from the Arctic. The Arctic is, of course, self-explanatory. The West Coast is an ecosystem all its own. It gets cool, but the rest of Canada really does roll their collective eyes when Vancouver complains about a snowfall that melts in a couple of days. I mean, there's a reason the capital of Manitoba is called Winterpeg. Before manufacturers started putting Gore-Tex in everything, Canadian families really did appreciate their knitting aunts and grannies. Sometimes even grandfathers who learned during the World Wars. There's nothing like a chunky, warm sweater or a pair of knit socks on a cold day. I grew up with hand-knit socks, mitts, hats, scarves, sweaters, you name it, we had it. You know what I remember Granny crocheting? Mum tells me that Granny crocheted a lovely lace tablecloth, but my vague memory dredges up decorative projects like the tree topper, fancy white lace doilies, garishly colored granny squares, and a few home accessories like coasters and cozies. Because my grandfather used hair cream, there was the odd antimacassar. Even her Afghan blankets were knit. Personally, I don't think there were as many patterns available for her at the time that she found attractive enough to crochet. If you remember any of the wild and wacky crochet of the 1970s and early 80s, comment down below. It really does help to laugh through the pain of it all. I've said before that Granny tried to teach me how to knit, and it didn't stick until I was in my 30s. She also tried to teach me to crochet, and I could chain stitch like nobody's business. As a result, I figured that crochet was easy and knitting was hard, and because I didn't want to make avocado green, dirty orange, and poop brown granny squares, I just didn't bother to pursue crochet any further. I mean, why would I?
Notorious knitters who were or are also writers haven't helped. Elizabeth Zimmerman considered crochet servant's work, or at least inferior. But this attitude was quite prevalent when lace-making machines were new, and the new lace was considered superior to previously hand-crocheted lace, and I think it was passed along to EZ, and she didn't know better. Several well-known bloggers, in early blog posts and books, mocked crochet a bit, but most have toned that down substantially and are very supportive of crochet currently. Yarn companies that sell non-acrylics, in the 80s and 90s, had salesmen, and often men who didn't knit or crochet, who would go to yarn stores and would say things like, "This yarn isn't good for crochet," meaning, It's not a cheap acrylic like those available in department stores, and later, big box craft stores and Wally Mart. Charles Voth, designer. Knitting and crochet veteran. Technical editor, Knitting Publications. Quora.com, May 16th, 2017.
Some of you may have heard the quote, "Life's too short to drink bad wine." And for many contemporary crafters, the same holds true for yarn. The knitting boom of the early 2000s brought with it a certain kind of yarn snobbery. The more accessible global market brought brands such as Skasel, Lang, Manos del Uruguay, Chapelle, Bergère de France, and Regia to audiences hungry for soft, durable yarns. Independent yarn dyers also rose to prominence, some growing from small companies with niche dye runs to large international concerns depending on popularity, color usage, and which commercial yarn blanks they were using as their dyeing base. Sock knitters heard podcasters gushing over yarn porn as they browsed websites for Wollmeise and Dream in Color. Independent yarn sellers started monthly sock yarn clubs, the high point of this phenomenon being the short-lived sock knitting convention Sock Summit. And the Loopy U, one of the first bespoke yarn vendors, grew from a small online store in the basement of a residential home to an actual storefront. Being Canadian, the exchange rate was always a limiter for me. By the time I'd saved enough money to order from one of the popular brands, either the store was sold out or the craze was over as the in-crowd moved on to another brand or club. I stashed what I could and did a lot of my yarn consumption vicariously through American bloggers and podcasters, some of whom would stock Canadian yarn companies and distributors because, and I paraphrase, if it's in Canadian dollars, you're getting it for free. It wasn't free for me, let me tell you. It's been years and I still have no first-hand experience just how heavenly that Wollmeise yarn actually was, because an order to an American distributor or store like the Loopy U would kill my yarn budget for a good 6-month period. That stuff's not cheap. For years, if you weren't buying a particular designer's catalog from a yarn store or ordering a pattern kit from Mary Maxim or similar mail-order yarn business, knitting and crochet seemed to be relegated to some pretty sketchy women's magazines targeting stay-at-home housewives. Usually some cheap, poorly printed rag your grandmother would pick up at the grocery store. As the knitting boom of the 1990s and early 2000s gained traction, glossy magazines started appearing in the grocer's magazine rack as well as at the yarn store, making the hobby a lot more visible. There was a time I could go into the local chain grocer and find Interweave Knits, Creative Knitting, Let's Knit, Knitters, Knit Today, Knit Style, or Knit Scene. I remember being really annoyed because I was waiting for the latest Interweave Knitting magazine to land. Might have been Knits or Piecework or one of the other specialty issues. And I found a magazine with a fabulous lace top. It was crochet, folks. Crochet. I honestly felt betrayed. I mean, how dare this beautifully shaped top with its bell sleeves and goth design be crochet? Didn't they know that lace was meant to be knit from fine yarns that cost an arm and a leg to procure? I mean, why would you cheapen it with acrylic crochet? See, I fell for one of the classic blunders. Right up there with never go in against a Sicilian when death is on the line. I mean, I thought crochet was something you did to use up all the cheap, scratchy acrylic that somehow manages to weasel its way into every stash. Usually through someone buying you yarn for baby sweaters or well-meaning friends who know you knit but don't know how to choose good yarn. I'm lucky. Most of my friends and family are crafters and or have good taste. We'll overlook the eyelash yarn disaster of 2005. The crochet I'd been exposed to over the years came in the form of household wares and the occasional afghan. It was normal to think of it as the domain of crafters' cotton and cheap acrylic. Here's a little tip. It often takes a bit more yarn to make an object with crochet than it does to knit. And many crocheters are very skilled at their craft, so their projects work up fairly quick. When that's the case, you can tend towards yarn that's less expensive because you don't want to break the bank on a project. I figured this out purely because I've been in that situation. The way I hold yarn for knitting and for crochet are both very different, so I don't find acrylic or cotton as hard on my hands when I crochet as I do when I knit. There's a lot less give and flexibility in crafter's cotton, and I find it really hurts my hands to knit it. Give me the same cotton and a hook, however, night and day. Similar experience with acrylics. I noticed the texture a lot less, and I'm not the only one either. When I went to start a crocheted Afghan project, Mum confirmed the same thing, as have friends who are crocheters. The tactile experience is just different. So if you're on the outside looking in at crochet, you see a lot of folks buying up what looks to be inferior materials, and you judge. Let's also look at this from the commercial point of view. You know that a knitter will buy a single ball of sock yarn to make a pair of socks or a shawlette or a hat or mitts. Because the crocheter is likely to need more yarn to make the same items, they'll possibly opt for a less expensive yarn. You're trying to market a boutique wool blend that will cost the buyer approximately $35 per 100 gram skein. Because the crocheter needs more yarn to finish their project, they're less likely to buy the 2 skeins they would need. They'll buy a lesser brand and say good enough, or they'll complain that the price of wool is extremely extravagant, which in this case it is. They're not saying anything we don't know. It's just easier to market the yarn directly to the knitters, who will buy at least 1 ball of yarn and pronounce with a sly wink that those crocheters don't know what they're missing, poor backwards thinking souls. I don't care who you are, 2 balls of yarn at $35 per skein, and I've seen some fairly plain wool blends go even higher depending on the popularity of the brand or dyer, is expensive. Even as a knitter, I'd balk at any project that would require 2 skeins. I may even have skeins of expensive yarn in my stash that are waiting for the perfect project, because the amount paid for the yarn necessitates a truly fabulous pattern. So why even go there? Well, as has been said about the possibly manufactured outrage over the unhealthiness of corsets to try and sell elasticated underwear, drama sells. There are full communities built and thriving on an us versus them mystique. Doesn't matter whether it's a yarn company trying to sell you a skein that's not suitable for crochet, or a book author or blogger trying to make themselves more relatable to their audience. For the record, if you can knit with it, you can probably crochet with it. If you really want to invest over $60 into a crocheted shawl because it looks or feels or drapes better than the acrylic alternative, do it. If there's a knitter literally hovering at your elbow trying to talk you out of it because crocheters don't use real wool, you have my permission to tell them to back off and get their own sandwich. That's a knitter who's looking to swoop in and grab the yarn you picked up first and popped in your basket. You have no time for craft vultures. Enjoy your purchase and your finished project, and may whatever deity you believe in have mercy on their soul.
Moving forward to Victorian times, crochet patterns became available for flower pot holders, bird cage covers, baskets for visiting cards, lamp mats and shades, waste paper baskets, tablecloths, anti-macassars, or antis, covers to protect chairbacks from the hair oil worn by the men in the mid-1800s, tobacco pouches, purses, men's caps and waistcoats, even a rug with foot warmers to be placed under the card table for card players. From 1900 to 1930, women were also busy crocheting afghans, slumber rugs, traveling rugs, chaise lounge rugs, sleigh rugs, car rugs, cushions, coffee and teapot cozies, and hot water bottle covers. It was during this time that potholders made their first appearance and became a staple of the crocheter's repertoire. Ruthie Marks, The History of Crochet via Crochet Guild of America.
The history of knitting is fairly well documented. Some extant examples remain from as early as the 11th century, and if it's not knitting, it's probably nalbinding, a Scandinavian fiber art that also uses yarn loops and looks remarkably like both knitting and crochet. The history of crochet is strangely murky. I'm basing most of my information here on History of Crochet by Ruthie Marks, the Wikipedia article on the history of crochet, as well as my own observations. Links, as always, in the description. It's been suggested that crochet originated in Arabia, South America, or China, or possibly in Scotland or France. All of these are interesting theories. Unfortunately, we have no concrete evidence of most of these origin stories. There's just no evidence put into text. Some sources indicate crochet may have been known in the 1500s under the name nun's lace or nun's work, but extant examples don't appear to be actual crochet. Marx's article mentions the use of lace tape, which indicates a Renaissance sewn or bobbin lace a la Battenberg, Branscombe, Brussels, and princess style laces. There's even a possible link to French tambour embroidery. Illustrations and descriptions of tambour tools are consistent with modern-day crochet hooks. It's not until the mid-1800s that actual verifiable crochet emerges in print, and many of the directions are vague or reliant on illustrations and prints. Archive.org and the Antique Pattern Library both house a few scans of antique books written by Mademoiselle Riego de la Bronchardière, whose work made fine lace more accessible to those who couldn't afford to purchase or make needle and bobbin styles. Crochet and other lace-making techniques kept many Irish families afloat during the years of the potato blight. Marx describes accounts of crocheted lace constructed in the poorest circumstances, stored in or on dirty floors or whatever surface presented itself, and only attaining its luxuriously pristine form after completion and washing. I can't certify how true this particular accounting is or whether it's conjecture and romanticism of the time. Lace making did become a profitable enterprise during the potato famine of the mid-1800s, with whole families joining lace-making cooperatives or participating in craft-centric schools or classes. Crochet was, to a certain extent, the YouTube of its time, a fallback career you could take with you wherever you went. Books from the Victorian period start detailing multiple crafts in single tomes. The books I've skimmed often assume the reader is female and working at her leisure. The same book will detail directions for knitting, crochet, embroidery, with other crafts thrown in as desired. Directions for knitting start toward the path of standard abbreviations, with directions from Miss Frances Lambert and Mrs. Jane Gauguin. Crochet, not so much. As Marx points out, those early patterns, which often were not accurate, would drive modern crocheters crazy. An 8-pointed star, for example, might turn out to possess only 6 points. The reader was expected, it turns out, to read the pattern, but to use the illustration as the more accurate guide. The Edwardian age sees quite a bit of crocheted lace. To be fair, I went looking for fancy net lace, and the more appealing designs turned out to be crochet. The motifs are less abstract. The problem is you then have to double check whether you're working from American patterns or British, because there's a significant difference in abbreviations dependent on where the pattern was published. And still, you get half a pattern plus a picture. I'm hoping to explore one such mystery project later this year. From the Edwardian era, there seems to be a split in crafts. Knitting and knitwear really take off from the 20s onwards. Warm fashions for motoring and socializing make way for car coats, ski sweaters, and golf wear of the 1950s. Knitting has consistently been recycling its own patterns and making them new through various yarn offerings. A Victorian jumper, complete with puffy sleeves, becomes a sparkly pink 1980s smash, and the sweater vest and cardigan make a comeback in the 90s when Twin Peaks is all the rage. But crochet? In a world where women were increasingly part of the workforce and machine-made lace was available at any department store, why would you even bother to waste all that time hand-crocheting the edging on a pillowcase? If you no longer need a chemise underneath your corset because you're wearing a brassiere, why would you crochet fine lace trim? Crochet became doilies and then granny squares. As long as a housewife needed to cook and had a husband who used Brill cream, there was a need for pot holders and antimacassars. Eventually, someone would take a pattern for a fine lace tablecloth, use some cheap acrylic, and turn it into a brightly colored throw. There was the boho granny square movement of the 1970s, but otherwise crochet went underground, relegated to household items and novelty crafts. Vestiges of the old art form would pop up now and again, but I think it's really only been in the past 10 years or so we've started to really see an uptick in crochet. I'm also noticing more interest in vintage or antique lace making lately, so that might just be me. As the advertisement says, I'm kinda soaking in it. I'm not hearing as much vitriol from either side of the knit versus crochet debate these days. It could be because the online yarn crafting community seems somewhat distanced from each other lately, or perhaps it's a surge of multi-craftualism that's sweeping YouTube. Maybe it's just a lot of folks who, like me, went looking for something pretty and found it where they least expected it. When I went looking for knitting versus crochet on Google, I found, scattered amongst dated complaints about knit snobbery or a lack of quality patterns for crochet, a list of links about which was easier to learn. To that I say, why not both? If there's one thing I can say for the Edwardians and the Greatest Generation, they didn't allow themselves to be pigeonholed over something as trivial as a hobby. If you'd like a Victorian knitting mystery, check up here. My continuing Chronicles of Contemporary Craft playlist is somewhere over here. Till then.